start recording now. We're also now streaming on the In the City for Good Facebook page. So we'll see who joins us there. First of all, welcome all of you joining us on Zoom and on Facebook to the In the City for Good Candidate Forum. This evening, we'll be hearing from school board candidates for positions 1, 3, and 7. Just a reminder that for our school board, candidates run for a certain position, but we each get to vote for one candidate in each position. So they don't represent certain sections of the city. So you'll be voting for 3 of the 6 candidates this evening. And as we go through the evening, we'll be posing their questions based upon the position they're running for. Your microphones have been muted and the chat room is closed. As I mentioned, we're streaming live to Facebook, and we're also recording this evening's session. My name is Dave Beal. I'm your host. I'm a member of the In the City for Good Steering Committee. In the City for Good is a grassroots organization formed in 2015 in response to the challenges and opportunities of growth in Rochester, with the belief that all residents should share in the responsibilities and benefits of that growth. Our members are organized into action teams that meet regularly to promote well-informed citizens and participation in civic governance. We host several public forums on local issues each year. This is our 3rd round of candidate forums. We can be reached at inthecityforgood@gmail.com. Though there is a value in witnessing candidates think on their feet and measure their off-the-cuff familiarity with issues, we think it's also useful to hear from them on questions they've had an opportunity to think about. With that in mind, each year we have provided candidates with questions prepared by our action teams. Each of our teams has submitted 2 questions, and for each question, the candidates were asked to prepare a 2-minute response. Each candidate in the forum will be asked to reply to the same question. We've also invited the community to submit questions, and we'll include those as time permits. The candidates have also been given a 1-minute closing statement, and they can use that time in whatever manner they choose. So we're starting with the assumption tonight that you're familiar with the candidates. Their names are on the screen if you need to be reminded of those. And so we'll forego any kinds of opening statements and get right to our list of questions. As I said, we'll move through the questions by position, and we'll try to rotate those and also the candidates in each position. So this evening, we'll start with position 1. The candidates are Don and Justin. You guys, in case they need to, want to just kind of wave, Don and Justin, there you go. And we'll start with Don tonight. Don, this first question comes from our housing action group. Many cities have included affordable housing units in their design for new school buildings. Would you ever consider working with the city of Rochester to include affordable housing units in future school building plans? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Certainly, and the answer is yes. But it's important to say that referendum dollars that are approved by voters are specific to educational spaces. But I would support district staff and consultant collaboration and working with the city of Rochester, especially in areas of its comprehensive plan, planning to succeed. There were issues that manifested themselves with earlier discussions regarding where the middle school would be located. And I know from the district point of view, our original thoughts were that would also potentially be a source of affordable housing should the developers undertake that effort. So on that personal level, and keep in mind as a board member, it's great to say, oh, I'll do this and I'll do that, but you're part of a board, and just 1 vote of 7. But I do recognize the need for and will be supportive of the opportunity to move forward.
Thanks, Don. Justin?
Yeah, so I would certainly be interested in pursuing any collaboration with the city of Rochester in future growth of the city. And perhaps one way to do that would be to include affordable housing units in a future school building plan. I don't really think that that's a very likely development. It's an interesting idea, and certainly any way to work better with the city of Rochester. I think the example of the placement of the middle school, not at the Hart Farm location and instead in the Northwest, is a great example of not, doing our best to work with to work cross-functionally between the city and the school district in the past, whether it was about the city's feeling on equity that would result at the Southwest location, or if it was about the capacity of the sewer shed or whatever. To me, it evidenced a failure to work through those strategic options much earlier in the cycle. So yeah, any way to work strategically on what the future needs of the city are going to be and how the school district can, or this, through the school board could facilitate those future needs, I think would be a wonderful development.
Okay. We'll go to position 3 now with Karen and Deborah. Would you all like me to repeat the question, or are you good?
I'm good.
Okay, so let's start with Karen.
First off, I'd like to recognize Don's comments about the financial aspects of what is being proposed here. I think that that's an important consideration. I also like that both the other 2 candidates already have used the word collaboration, because I think that's incredibly important. I look at this a little bit different. So my answer is yes. Sorry, I forgot that part first. My answer is yes, I would definitely consider it. And I looked at it a little bit different perspective. I hadn't really contemplated this as an issue. So I did a little research, and some of the things that I read about it talked about it being advantageous to perhaps some communities and students in our school district that perhaps need some additional services. So looking at it as the articles that I read talked more about it, the affordable housing, even including things like something related to the housing authority, where if it's located near the school, they could provide additional services and even extended services. I kind of looked at it from like an elementary school perspective, additional support, things that we've learned from the pandemic, like additional technology that could be available through the housing, if it's not available to the students in their own individual units. So I looked at it very much as an opportunity for community partnership to extend the success of our local community schools as a way to build community. And I kind of looked at it from a perspective of, I see a lot of times in Rochester that we have people that are, it's like a have or a have not community. And I think that it would improve that scenario. And then finally, helping with the relationship with the city council, as the other 2 candidates already talked about. I think that there's room for growth there. And I would add to that from my own candidacy. It's one of the reasons that I looked at running for school board, because I have worked for the county for many years. I've been involved in various boards and commissions that have some contact with community leaders. And I think that that's something that I would bring to a new school board, is some of those connections that are existing already.
Okay, thanks, Deborah.
So thank you for having us, and good evening. So the question specifically was about new school buildings with housing embedded, and that's probably not something I would be in support of or a fan of, simply from a capacity and bandwidth standpoint. I do love the ideas of collaboration and co-location, and I think that there's definitely some potential in the future to perhaps have parcels of acreage that co-hosted a school that would be run by the school district, but then a housing entity or community space that would be run by either the county or privately or something completely different. I just know that when I think about the capacity of our district to serve the needs educationally of our students, adding on something like the complexity of housing, which is not an area I know much about, but even just thinking about liability and rental and advertising and maintenance and all those things makes me feel a little bit overwhelmed. We do work really closely with the Housing and Redevelopment Authority, and I think for our district at our size right now, that makes the most sense. We have seen some programs here to support housing and across the state and nation as well, more supported by outside agencies in, rental support, things like that, finding space for families or even students. But I don't believe that that should be a primary responsibility of the school district.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. And now for the candidates for position 7, we'll start this time with Jesse. Jess.
Yes, thank you. I would always be open to considering any opportunity to level a playing field and to bring a more equitable existence for families, our educators, our staff. So the easy part of the answer is yes, I would absolutely consider. And I think that Rochester is a place where we could probably do this fairly easily if we allowed ourselves. So I would think versus Chair Seelinger's point is that, by ending your own short-term discomfort for progress, to me, is not an option. So I also don't know much in terms of like the housing aspect, but it's something that I would certainly be willing to learn about and hear more about. And like I said, I think that Rochester could certainly do this easily. So rather than gentrifying our neighborhoods, we could repurpose buildings, materials also to minimize environmental impact. We could institute more inclusionary zoning practices. If we do affordable housing options and make it much more, if we make it more inclusive, I think that would make, I think to Karen's point, easier to kind of manage the needs across the district. The one thing that I would be concerned about, though, and I would need more information on this, is if we attach affordable housing to a school building project in the future, I would want to be careful about how that's done so that we're not unintentionally creating a designated low-income school within a district. So that would be something that I would want to make sure that, even though, yes, it would be beneficial, that we are balancing that out as well.
Mark?
Do I support the idea? In theory, yes. Facilities and housing are something that I certainly know a fair amount about. And this particular topic, I've actually already had conversations with a couple city council candidates on how I feel this is actually very important. Do I think the facilities should be housed at a school, though? Not so much. But do I think that the school district should work with the city and the county, not just the city, but the city and the county, for an affordable housing option that has an educational facility as well as social services as well? Yes, I think this is something the city of Rochester very much needs. I think the 3 local governments should very much work together. And yeah, I'm very supportive. Again, from a school district point of view, as was pointed out, our financing options are a lot more restrictive than financing options from the city of Rochester or the county of Olmsted. So the question, I think, is maybe a little bit misworded, but yes, it's very important. We should have an educational facility, social services, as well as affordability.
Okay, thanks, Mark. The next question comes from our Social Justice and Social Services Action Group, and we'll start the answers with position 3. What specific actions would you propose to address the academic issues for homeless students in our district and to help them receive the same opportunities and to succeed? Why don't we start with Deborah?
Thanks. So our homeless students are protected under the McKinney-Vento Act, which ensures that our homeless children and youth have equal access to the same free and appropriate public education, and that they are also provided transportation to their school of origin. That being said, we know that there are still many needs that our staff are working really hard to accommodate. Right now, we have about 144 identified homeless youth in our district. We know at least 3 students living in their cars, is what I'm told by our staff person as of now. And generally throughout the year, we run around about 350 homeless students. I think our staff works really, really hard at drilling down to meet the needs of individual students and what they need. And we know that students are going to have academic challenges if their basic needs aren't met, if their housing is vulnerable, if their food stability is vulnerable, mental health issues, all of those things. And so our staff is really able to look at what the child needs. Do they need a mental health service? Do they need help applying to medical assistance? Do they need dental services, eyeglasses? Do they need clothing? The list kind of goes, they just kind of go down the list and how they can serve them. They come into our system through social worker referral, sometimes through registration, sometimes through the women's shelter. And we just have to drill down really individually. We also know that there's a gap. We talk a lot about homelessness in our city, or it's been a topic, but that's really for single vulnerable adults. Homeless families, homeless unaccompanied youth are really not talked about, and we really don't have facilities to serve them. So we are doing the best we can. But as I think we all agree, collaboration, partnership, how can we figure this out together? That's what's really going to help us shape and solve this problem.
Okay. Karen?
So to give a little bit more context here, when I looked into this issue a little bit, I came across a couple of studies that were from the 2019-20 school year in reference to the entire state of Minnesota. One study set the homeless population at 9,000 students in the state, and another one at 17,000. So I think that indicates that there's likely lots of disparities in these data, and whether it's self-reporting or other types of reporting, it's kind of a moving target. The other important part to point out is that there's a lot of racial disparity, in that 75% of those students are minority students. So I think that's something we really need to focus on. In terms of helping address their academic issues, my main focus would be to remove barriers to their academic participation and success. I would broaden the definition of homeless to have people think about perhaps some of these students might be runaways, or people who are young people who are not safe at their own homes. So looking at services to address that issue. I think that, as indicated earlier, that Women's Shelter likely has some of these young people in their community as well. So making sure that there are domestic violence services offered if they're not in the shelter already, and looking at it as a safety perspective. If there needs to be extra security measures, if that's desired, to talk to the students about that. And then also the issue of privacy, that it's not something they likely would want their peers to know about their social situation. So making sure that that is protected. I'd also bring to the conversation that it's somewhat of a difficult topic, but also screening them for a sex trafficking issue, that if that is an issue, to refer them to further services for that. But then broader than that, in the community, looking at relationships with landlords to see if we can establish some housing that would fit their needs, even if the budget allows to provide for some rental assistance if needed. I've heard that St. Paul is implementing that, and it sounds like it's very helpful, particularly in the pandemic, that rental assistance to families in the district has prevented them from being homeless. As we also learned from the pandemic, the issue of technology is significant. So if we need to provide technology, and then really in the forefront, providing flexibility for these students, whether it be, working with teachers to extend their deadlines, creative options to keep them on track towards graduation, I think is really the goal here, and encouraging them to stay in school if at all possible. And finally, the general concept of just being understanding with their situation.
Okay, thanks, Karen. And we'll go down to position 7, Mark.
I think the answer for this one actually pairs well with the last question that we had. And we talk homeless and we talk, say, affordable housing. There's no real reason why we could not pair those two together. Like I said in my last answer, if we had affordable housing that had social services as well as academic areas as well, you combine that with the community schools that we have going on, it's a good solution to the problem that we have now with our homeless students, because our community schools, they bring more than just an academic level to the schools. They bring some of the community as well, and they do have social services. It is a good partnership with Olmsted County Community Health. Again, bringing the two together: affordable housing, community schools, social services, academic areas for after school. That's the direction that we need to go to help our homeless students. We need to help them be unhomeless if at all possible.
Okay. Jess?
Yeah, so we've already talked about a number of ways to move toward addressing housing insecurity to reduce the number of students and their families that are facing homelessness. So we've talked about community schools and affordable housing. I think we also need to stop the gentrification of the city, where we're plowing over what would otherwise be affordable housing to build businesses or other housing that's out of reach for anyone who isn't a doctor or a lawyer. And I realize that that specifically is beyond the immediate school board scope, but this is where we would absolutely move towards partnerships, collaborations with committees outside of ourselves. We need to make sure that those that are working towards making DMC a thing are also committed to keeping people outside of the immediate medical community in mind. Beyond Mayo, how can you take care of people who are already here, those who want to come here, rather than making it impossible for anybody who's not, at the very least, upper middle class from being able to live here. I'm also a fan of assessment. So if we assess every student in the district beyond just their academic success, looking at mental health, physical health, economic health, Karen mentioned a few other things, such as sexually exploited children. We also heard about unaccompanied minors. So as much as we are able to assess that and mobilize resources in those directions, because the data shows that we need it there, that's where we need to move it. I think because we are attempting to be an area that is providing world-class healthcare, I think it's unacceptable to have so many homeless students in our city. And so I think that other committees should be sort of knocking on our door and councils to figure out how to solve this problem with us, for sure.
Thank you. And position one, and we'll start with Justin.
Yes, thank you. So, I think that the community schools are certainly important. We have 2 elementary schools that have Title I funding now. And, according to the stats that we have, one of them, Riverside Central, 4% of the students have housing insecurity problems right now. That's more than double the more than double the percentage of any of the other schools. So, that's notable that there's a significant concentration, but it's also notable that there are students with housing insecurities at almost all of our schools, between 0.5% to 1.5% at nearly all the other ones. So this really is a ubiquitous problem. There is some degree of concentration, but or problem issue, however you want to characterize it, it is not something that is neatly kind of tucked into one part of our community. And so the community schools, I think, play a significant role. But beyond that, there has to be, and there has to continue to be a very significant focus on making this a core competency of every single school in the district through assessment and identification of needs, partnering with the other resources within the community, both governmental and nonprofit, to make sure we're getting the full potential out of every single student.
Thank you, Justin. Don?
Well, what I would propose to address the academic issues for homeless students would to ensure that their social, emotional supports are in place. It's important to communicate to them that it's not their fault. Perhaps parental decisions, trauma, other issues that have already been mentioned. We have to be able to instill within them the belief that in spite of their current situation, there's a future ahead for them. I think it is important, if we're going to ensure their academic success, that we provide the community resources, the medical support, the food, housing, and mental health supports to bring that about.
Okay, thanks, Don. The remaining questions will be coming from our education action team, and I hope again to be able to include a few questions from the community as well. the first question, and with this one, we'll start with position 7, and Jess, you'll get the first crack at this. What specific actions would you propose to address the academic, I'm sorry, that's the one we just asked. Racial disparities in academics and discipline continue to be a major concern in Rochester Public Schools. What should the role of the school board be in working to address these problems?
Yes, thank you for the question. So as I'm sure everybody, all the candidates here know, the basic functions of school board are to set policy, oversee the budget, and to evaluate the performance of the superintendent. So in each of those things, or in each of those areas, are things that the school board can do to address these issues. So when we're setting policies, they should be equitable, anti-xenophobic policies. So asking all of our policy items, who does this benefit and who does it not? Who is being marginalized or oppressed by this decision? When we set things like the budget, we could ask ourselves very similar questions. Are our priorities, you know, do they increase in equity? And if so, how do we change that when we're sort of triaging what our budget should be? When we look at our superintendent, what are they doing to support the entirety of the school district in an equitable way? Are they behaving in a way that is open and responsive to marginalized groups, and, you know, seeking out voices we don't hear from, rather than only bending to the pressure of those that we hear from all the time? So I would say I'm a huge fan of having staff and educators also do racial identity work, at the very least, if not all other aspects of potential implicit bias, which I know that they had already started doing. So that being said, I think the board should also do the same. We should be the kind of leaders that would never ask others to do things that we wouldn't do for ourselves. And so we should be absolutely setting an example in our own personal work as board members, individual work as board members, in addition to infusing equity across all of our major functions.
Mark?
It's interesting because a lot of my answer is a lot like Dr. Garcia's, where, you know, the board does have 3 areas of responsibility. And, you know, we'll start, you know, with the policy. Of course, we need to make sure our policies are equitable across all of our students. And, you know, we do have a review cycle for all of our policies. I, fortunately or unfortunately, have not been on a policy committee yet, so I don't know at what depth they go through. I'm sure it's pretty deep, but, you know, taking the equitable lens as we go through our policy on a very regular scheduled review process would be something that we must do. From a budget point of view, not only do we need to make sure the things that we're spending our money on are, of course, most equitable, we also need to make sure that they're the most financially responsible. You know, one of the topics in front of the school board right now is we have a budget coming up, and we want to add a cabinet level equity administrator. That's going to cost money at the end of the day in a very tight budget that we have. So when we can be very cost conscious on everything that we do, we can ensure that we can afford a cabinet level equity administrator. Extremely important. And of course, the supervision of the superintendent. You know, I feel that perhaps we should have goals. Of course, we always have goals for the superintendent. We should always at least have one goal in this space. It does not mean that he should only be held to one goal, but I do think there should be one raised at that level.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go now to position 1, and Don, you get the first response this time.
Okay, well, I won't mention what has already been clearly identified. There are 3 functions, yes. But additionally, in terms of actual work of the board, I think we must acknowledge the truth of lived experience, okay, to not be in denial of what our students and or families may be saying. We must acknowledge that. We must begin to honor the student voice. We should begin to, as we have, but to even delve deeper and involve families and engage communities. And can't overly emphasize this enough. And then hold the one employee that we have responsibility for accountable for mission completion. Of course, the board should set the mission parameters, the expectations, those goals that we have, and then use that as a measurement to ensure that the superintendent is delivering as desired and as our students need.
Okay, thank you, Don. And Justin.
Yeah, so thanks so much for this question. I see the role of the school board. The others that have already answered have honed in very specifically on the technical levers of power that the school board has to influence policy throughout the district through supervision of the superintendent and advancement of policy and so on. But I think there's a really important role for the school board to fill, members of the school board to fill as individuals to create the space for this kind of work to be done. And that is, being sort of a thought leader within the community, engaging with the press and community organizations and whoever will listen, frankly, to make clear that addressing racial disparities, and especially because so much of the discussion is in the context of looking through an equity lens and deciding who wins and who loses and so on, that entire discussion is scary to people because they think, oh, am I the one that loses? Do I need to be worried about this type of work? And so I think that an important role that I would undertake, certainly on the school board, is to make clear to everyone that this is about growing the pie. This is about unleashing the potential of every single student so that we end up in a better version of our own community. 10 years down the road, 12 years down the road, 15 years down the road, we'll have a more vibrant, more robust economy as a result of addressing these disparities today, because we're going to get the full potential out of every single student when they are able to engage in a culturally competent and inclusive environment where there are a diversity amongst teachers so that every single student sees themselves reflected both in their teachers and in the curriculum. And that the goal of all this work is to get us to a better future. So that I think is an important thing that I would add.
Thanks, Justin. And now from the candidates for position 3, and we'll start with Karen this time.
Thank you for the question. This topic is one of the reasons that I decided to throw my hat in the ring and run for school board, that it's near and dear to my heart. And I worked in the local juvenile court system for about 15 years. So it's where I kind of cut my teeth on the issue of racial disparities and the issues that face our young people in the community. So this is an important issue to me. In terms of academics, I think where I come from on that aspect of this question is it's the district culture. And I leave that to the professionals and would encourage the professionals to, from a policy perspective from the board. And I agree with what all the earlier comments about the board's role here. But I would encourage the professionals to encourage students who show promise and skills, but may not yet show up in their test scores for things like the highly gifted program, any gifted programming, honors courses, AP courses, or post-secondary options. That I think in terms of academics, those are the things that I think if we can adjust the racial makeup of those programs, I think it will improve the academic success of all of our students. There are other innovative programs that are coming online like P-TECH, which is purposely designed to assist underrepresented populations in the particular areas of nursing, and then the technology field that recognizes that they need to work on diversifying their workforce. And finally, looking for creative opportunities for students in all areas. In terms of the discipline issue, this is a tough issue, and it's been something the district has struggled with. I recognize the role of the district, but I've watched very closely to the data that's been submitted to the district in their data reports. And I'd really like to take a deeper dive into that data as a board, to listen more specifically to the leaders in the particular buildings, to get specifics about where that data is coming from, perhaps run through some of the scenarios. It sounds like from the policy that the buildings meet together. I'd want to sit in on some of those meetings and hear what exactly is said, and then ask a lot of questions, and using that information to inform the board to look if there needs to be some policy changes. I actually looked through the student conduct policy as I was preparing for tonight and realized from a prior prosecutor perspective, I would want to ask for some clarifications to the current policy. The word assault is not defined in the levels of behavior or in the definitions, but it is addressed in the policy itself, and also addressing specifically threats of harm. I didn't feel like the policy addressed that very well, and I could see that that's something that other students and teachers may deal with. It also defines quote unquote illegal conduct, and that seemed really vague, that perhaps needs some further definition. I would like to see some, also looking at the behaviors to see if there's any correlation, particularly at the elementary level, to classroom environment or academic performance, to see if some of these disruptive behaviors are coming out of frustration with things that are happening in the classroom, or in terms of racial disparities in their academic progress, that I think that that's something the district really needs to look at. So finally, I would look for action from the board to incorporate anti-racist curriculum into the curriculum, and also encourage teachers to have classroom conversations around this issue.
Karen. Deborah?
Thank you. Last time these candidates were together, Mark brought out the fact that someone's always got to be the tail, right? And so we have one question for the whole kit and caboodle of us. So no one's going to say ditto at the end, and I certainly won't. But it's one of those internal candidate jokes that we can all smile about, right? I just wanted to talk about, under this question, the opportunity the board is going to have coming up in November to work with the Midwest and Plains Equity Assistance Center. When we've been working on this opportunity, almost a year, actually. Don Barlow was chair when this came as an idea to the board, and we've been working to schedule it ever since. And it will be a virtual multi-hour event, but we're really excited about that. They are of the position that the professional development of school board members is really important, and I certainly agree. What our role is on the board is different than what the role is of the administration. And so their professional development is going to challenge us to look at ourselves and our board policies and practices. And I think that's going to be a great opportunity to think about how we can change the philosophy in our district, the attitudes in our district, and our practices. We're also creating an equity plan. We know that that's been coming for a little while. It is probably coming to the board this fall and has to be seen in conjunction and hooked to the strategic plan. But I think, again, that's a great opportunity for the board to encourage and support the work that administration is doing. And finally, one of the other things the board has talked about this summer, I initiated a conversation about community engagement. And I think that is crucial. Director Barlow and I have served on the Community Engagement Committee since its inception on the board in 2015. And we've had some good opportunities. I think we should make those opportunities a little bit more planful and systemic, working with staff in the district who are already making relationships with marginalized communities like our family engagement community. I think helping them sort of introduce and help us build trust with marginalized communities, I think will go a long way. Our equity specialists as well have access to students and families that perhaps are not as readily seen in our board work. We hear a lot of feedback from families, but we know that many times it is people of privilege with access to email the board or call the board or stand before the board. And I think our board is really ready to focus on voices of all community members. And as Don mentioned, specifically our student voices, that's been a focus in the last year as well.
Okay, thank you. The next question is something that most of you referenced in the board responsibilities. And we'll start again now with position 1. And Justin, you'll get the first reply here. it's slightly different than the question you received. It's the same topic, but it's been revised to kind of acknowledge that you're going to have a different point of view on this. The school board has direct responsibility, as some of you mentioned, for the performance and ongoing contract of the superintendent. Recently, the three incumbents with us this evening voted to extend the superintendent's contract until June 30th, 2022. We're going to ask you what the basis of that vote was, understanding that there may be some personnel elements that you won't be able to share, but certainly some basis can be public. For those of you who are seeking a seat on the board, we'd ask you if you would have supported or opposed this contract extension had you had the opportunity, and why you would have done so. So Don, we'll start with you.
Yes, thank you for the question. And let's be clear, the contract was extended for 1 year. The superintendent is currently in a 3-year contract. So the contract that was approved is for 1 year. And I will say, in my looking at the opportunities and challenges before us, I believed it was crucial to have continuity of the superintendent, given the climate of COVID, and then given the reality of the challenges that are before us, major construction, new schools coming online, and then a clear communication of board expectation. So I felt very comfortable and confident in extending the contract offer for an additional year.
Thanks, Don. And Justin, I apologize. You should have had the first chance at this one, but your response?
Well, I don't know if I would have voted to extend the contract. I understand the reasons for doing it, and I appreciate that we're in an uncertain time, and that having some continuity at that level, and especially recognizing that you've just come out with a 3-year plan that contemplates hiring an associate superintendent, next year, in the beginning in the 21-22 school year, that extending what was a 3-year contract by an additional year might provide some additional kind of breathing room so that the board has an opportunity to consider what is in the best interest of the future of the district, and whether it ought to continue under the leadership of the current superintendent, or whether it makes sense to initiate a search process. That's me reading between the lines a little bit, and also kind of putting my own gloss of how I would have been approaching it at that juncture. I'm sorry, I'm not, I can't give you a definitive answer because I wasn't expecting that question. Perhaps I should have, but I'll tell you a little bit about my kind of philosophy for what I would look to in whether to renew a contract generally in the future. And that is, the superintendent is not the same as any other employee. Any other professional, there's annual goals, and you sort of judge them based on whether they met their goals, and there's sort of a fairness element to it. And certainly the school board doesn't want to be a mercurial supervisor of its one employee and be sort of haphazard that way. But to me, the ultimate question is whether renewal of the contract is in the best interest of the future of the school district. That really does have to be the ultimate question, and it can take into account how well the rest of the community is working with the superintendent, how inclusive the superintendent is able to be. And I can just tell you from the campaign work that I've done, I think that there are some problems right now. I think that there's a perception of a great deal of defensiveness that is traced back to the superintendent, lack of willingness to engage and to be transparent about a whole set of issues. And And I think that there would be some real benefits to, shaking up the top and allowing an opportunity for some fresh leadership and some fresh ideas. But I recognize that, there's some unique circumstances right now that would have led to the 1-year contract rather than what would have been a conventional 3-year extension. That's all I got there.
Okay. And we really wasn't trying to catch you off guard on this question. You did receive a question that talked about how you'd evaluate the superintendent. I just wanted to acknowledge that a decision had recently been made and try to reframe the response in that way. So that's what's going on there. So we'll move to position 3 and start with Deb.
Thanks. So, I want to acknowledge Justin and Karen and Jess. This is kind of a Monday morning quarterback question for you 3. And honestly, I think it's a little bit unfair having not had been in the room, so to speak, and had time in the district. So, I'm just going to say, you get to answer what you want to answer. So if you don't feel comfortable, I say don't answer it. Sorry, I'm being big and bold, and maybe that's rude. But, I did support the 1-year contract for the superintendent. Similarly to Director Barlow, these are unconventional, unusual times, and a steady hand, I think, is going to really help us get through the next few years. But in addition, I think, evaluation is a really a difficult, for me, I'll speak personally, evaluation of the superintendent is difficult. And I'll tell you why. It's not a requirement, surprisingly, that we evaluate a superintendent. I had a conversation recently with a board member from another city who said until she came on the board 8 years ago, their board did not evaluate the superintendent. It was shocking. But let me tell you why I think it's problematic. Minnesota School Board Association, we are required to do phase 1 and phase 2 training as school board members. We are the only locally elected body in Minnesota that is required to do training. Nowhere in that mandatory training do they talk about evaluation of the superintendent. They have a separate workshop on evaluation. Matter of fact, they have a whole workbook on evaluation. But as an integral part of our job, we are 7 people with 1 employee who come from a variety of experiences, working with other people, perhaps managing or supervising other people. And last year, we really tried to implement a tool that was agreed upon by both the superintendent and the board that we felt would give us a way to fairly and accurately evaluate the superintendent. And then we kind of did a debrief in August. What did we think about this tool? And I think it was a good attempt. I think there was still some things that were problematic. A rubric is perfect for some instances. A rubric in this case might have been a little bit problematic. But we have convened another committee to look at the tool and look at the goals of the superintendent for the next year. That will come back to the board for support and agreement. And then we'll, and then we'll move forward from there. But this is hands down, 8 years on the board. Superintendent evaluation is one of the most difficult tasks I have ever had to do.
Karen?
So I appreciate Chair Sealinger's comments on the issue, but I also think this is a good demonstration, with the shift in question a little bit. Can we make tough decisions? Can we think on our feet? Can we make decisions, as we go here? I also give Justin a lot of credit for going first, that a little bit older brain needs a little more time to process. So I think I'm good here. I approach this question as it's revised here as a little bit of a political question. I've been watching the board meetings since January when I was thinking about this role. And I recognize by watching the interactions closely, both in person and via Zoom, that I would ultimately have opposed the contract extension, primarily because as a functioning board and the board working well together, it was clear to me that the contract extension was going to pass. So I would have taken this approach similar to Director Amundsen, that she did ask for this to come off the consent agenda and to do a voice vote on the topic. I would have joined her in opposing it, knowing that 5 other board members would have voted for it and it would have passed, primarily because we're in the pandemic and uprooting the superintendent position at this time and in trying to search for another one would not, as Justin said, would not be in the best interest of our school or our community. But kind of shifting to the original question of what I would look at to in the idea of where I came to that decision that I would oppose the extension is I agree with Justin's comment about there are times where I have either talked to community members or I've seen it myself in some of the board meetings that I think that the superintendent can become defensive. I'm just going to call it out as I see it, that I'll just leave it at that. I think that he does a good job in terms of the facility. I think he's done a good job in terms of responding to the pandemic. So the facility, the budget, the finance, I think he has a really strong cabinet in terms of finance. But I think there's so much more that could be done and could be done on a faster time frame and earlier in terms of the district culture related to equity, in terms of community partnerships with other local government organizations, and in terms of engagement with the community, students, families, teachers, and staff. I think those are all places where I think he could have done a better job. And that's ultimately why I would oppose it, but knowing that the contract was going to pass and that would be best for the district at this point in time.
And now with position 7, we'll start with Mark.
Was I supportive of a 1-year extension? Yes. You know, one of the things I do in my day job is I do supervise people. I've supervised people for a number of years. I've been on other boards of directors and supervisory roles of executive directors. And one of the things I look for in an employee, which in this case, the superintendent is the board's employee, is what are their strengths and their weaknesses? And in their weaknesses, are they making progress and making their weaknesses strengths? Is the superintendent a perfect employee? No, he's not. Nobody is. Is he moving things in a better direction than where they used to be? Yes, I do think he is. Are some things moving fast enough? That's discussable. But again, from a supervisory role, he's doing a good job. Should it be a great job for our community? Yes, it should be. And it would be very, our community feels we have issues now with the superintendent. What would happen if we uprooted the superintendent of the school district in the middle of a pandemic? I think our community would truly find out what problematic is if we did that. We do have to take our environment into account. And, you know, and quite frankly, with the superintendent being a person of color and in his first superintendent role ever, I do think a little bit of latitude should be provided as well. Because one thing I have seen in him over the number of years is, yes, he may be defensive, but he listens and he internalizes it. I see him make improvements in those spaces. I'd say even in his defensiveness, I don't think it's as bad as it used to be, but it could certainly be better.
Thank you, Mark. And finally, then Jess.
Yes, thank you. I agree. It is kind of difficult to Monday morning quarterback, especially when we were not there for all of the information. And I can appreciate why the current board members would have wanted to extend the contract. But my immediate reaction is I would have voted no based on the information that I've gotten from my would-be bosses, so voters in the district, a vast majority of them educators and other staff members that I've spoken to that have reached out to me on their own time. And I think that they've also reacted to some of the defensiveness and frankly dismissiveness of the superintendent. And I have also, similar to what Karen was mentioning, observed it in board meetings, either there in person or via their YouTube channel. And it is my job as a clinical psychologist to observe and analyze human behavior and also their interactions. And I will say to my opponent's comment about, you know, he's moving in the right direction. My take on that was he was pushed in the right direction, that it was not a direct, I'm gonna move and lead the charge on this. It was, to be frank, a number of current and former students who finally put their foot down, and then they were supported by other organizations, NAACP, the Unitarian Universalist Church, et cetera, and making demands of the school district. So I think the way that the question was originally worded to us is what would be looking at, and I guess this is a little bit broad, but are they worth, especially in a budget shortfall that we're going to have, is the superintendent worth their over $200,000 salary? And I think we would really need to take a look at that. And there are a number of things that I think could certainly be evaluated. And while it's difficult, I also agree that we have to make sometimes decisions on the fly. And that would be mine.
Thank you. The next question will start with position 3, and Karen, you'll get the first response to this. Property taxes are a key concern for all residents of Rochester, and this is especially true for homeowners on fixed or lower incomes. While school taxes are only one part of the overall property tax amounts, how do you plan to work to address the concerns of those who are finding their property taxes a significant burden?
Thank you for the question. This one is a little bit of a tough one for me because I generally come from the perspective of funding our schools is an investment in our future and in our children's future. And I know that there are low-income people in our community, or elderly people that are in fixed incomes that perhaps have put their kids through school and are finished with that part of their lives, but still address and have to want to remain in their homes where the property taxes keep increasing. This is something where I would really like to involve the community further in terms of, are there things in the district's budget that could be shifted to certain types of public and private partnerships? Can the community step up, particularly in response to our pandemic, when we're going to be struggling with some very difficult budget decisions? What can our community do for us in these difficult times? What kind of private partnerships can we develop, fairly quickly to take on some of this financial burden? I'd also want to look at take a very deep dive into the budget and look for efficiencies. That's where perhaps with potentially 3 new candidates and seats on the board, we might have a fresh perspective on what the budget looks like. I'd also want to take a close look at the budget and the programs that are in place. I would want to focus on eliminating redundancies and waste, but I also come from the perspective of prioritizing our people and our academics, that those would be the key priorities for me. And potentially looking at increasing fees for extracurricular activities, but then tying in with that another community aspect. If we can figure out a way for private partnerships or community-based scholarships for those types of things for the lower income students that aren't able to afford those increase in fees, to make that system more equitable. But I recognize the issue for our taxpayers. I think it's gonna be an important community conversation, and I'd love to be part of that.
Thank you, Karen. Deborah?
Thank you, and thanks for unmuting me, Dave. I was hearing my dog barking, so just give me a sign if anybody's hearing that. The district, I think, has worked really hard to keep our property tax percentage low. Mr. Carlson just presented on this this month, and we are really fortunate to be in a community that has a growing tax base. And so even though our needs continue to increase, the tax burden is remaining relatively flat or going down. And so that's a good thing. 40% of our property tax percentage is voter approved, our voter approved referendum. And then the other 60% is based on formulas by the Minnesota Department of Education and the legislature. So some of the things when I think about our property tax and the topic of that, there are levers that we can control and levers that we can't. And unfortunately in education, a lot of things are out of our control. The other thing that we talk about in the school district is that, the city and county are able to raise property taxes just on their own. And we are not. And so we have to go to the voters to get those property taxes increased through referendum. And sometimes it results, if we have seen years when the city or county has increased the property tax, that when we have to run a referendum, people vote no because they've had enough increases in their property tax. So their ability to do that impacts our ability to levy in our district. I will point out that every year we have to hold a public meeting on property tax in December when we set that levy. And this year we are determining whether that will be virtual participation or safely in person. So stay tuned. But we do invite all our citizens to reach out to us and speak to the property tax levy that we will be setting in December. Thank you.
Thanks, Deborah. Where am I? I think we're at position 7, and we'll start with Jess.
Yes, thank you. I think that this is a good plug for why our education should be fully funded by our state government. So instead of having to piecemeal how we exist, there should be a set aside money for us every year. And so for that, I know that there was a reference of there are things that are out of our control, but there are things that we can create control around. And we can do that through healthy boundaries and expectations with other community partners, educating our community, lobbying for our future, which means we would need to be doing that through the Minnesota Department of Education, as well as with our legislature, and making sure that we have those relationships. I would also argue that we could look at partnerships outside of Rochester. So our district isn't just Rochester. And so for those areas where we might want to tap, Orinoco or Iota or Zumbro Falls, that we can do that and we can negotiate with them, and our city council can negotiate with them as well to figure out, we're all trying to get through this together. What parts of these things should we be all, taking responsibility for? And I think it kind of goes back to in the City for Good, your prepared statement, you were saying something about, all residents have to take responsibility and also share in the growth of our community. And I think that would be our version of doing that as the school board.
Thanks. Mark.
A lot of the same ideas, I completely agree. We do need to be doing, as I said earlier, collaborations with the other local governments. So not just the school district, but all the local governments that are taxing entities on our residents can operate as efficiently as we all can operate, not just the school district, but the city and the county as well. And that will come through collaborations. But also, as one of the things that we need to do as school board members is see a larger picture of when all of these individual budgetary items come through, as well as purchases for product such as technology throughout the year, of keeping a fiscally responsible view on things. I've mentioned this at school board meetings, where there are times where we could be buying a less expensive product that is just as good. The school district's budgets, we just don't have just one budget. We have a multitude of budgets that we need to manage, and certain things can come out of certain things and others cannot. When you talk about the general budget, which is what teachers are paid for, as well as things like technology, we need just to be responsible in that space, because the budgets are funded by the taxes, and if we're spending money not as well as we should, we're in a certain sense, spending taxes that aren't spent as well as they should. And I also agree that we should have the relationships with our local legislators. Again, a local legislator, she is the Senate committee chair for education funding. A lot of people may or may not know that, but that's a good relationship that we have, that hopefully we can get her to see to fully fund things like special education, which is not fully funded, or to see things like when education financing goes up 2%, but our expenses go up 3.5%, that 2% probably is not enough because it's going to cost tax dollars locally at the end of the day for our constituents. So having those relationships with the state, watching legislation and seeing where it can help, having collaborations with the other local governments to spend money wisely. Those are some of the things that we should be doing.
Thanks, Mark. And now to position one, and Justin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so property taxes, this is tough. And for anybody on a fixed or lower income, the last thing they want to see is an increase in taxes. I think that's almost goes without saying. And it sort of underlines for me why property taxes are such a poor means to raise funds for a government service in the first place. The only thing worse is maybe sales taxes. And so the best option is to advocate for fully funding our education system through the state income tax. We're as the Rochester School Board, none of us, certainly not as individuals, are going to be in any position to move that. But just to underscore and make sure that message is as clearly delivered as it possibly can, that really is the best way to solve this problem. And for anyone on a fixed income or lower income worried about their property tax bill, to recognize that that increasing the revenues through the income tax is really the best way to go about this. But absent that, to underscore that really what we're in the business of doing here, and I'm sort of from the corporate world, and so we don't have a product that we're selling. We can't match our expenditures to revenues that are coming in from income on a product that we're selling. Our citizens are much more like a strategic investor who's interested in the long-term view of the product that we're eventually putting out, which is the future economic contributors of our own community. And so if we want to keep growing the tax base, which ultimately makes this a lesser burden for any individual property taxpayer to have to shoulder, the best way to do it is to keep growing our economy in the first place and to really embrace the brightest possible vision of what our schools can be and the future that they will unleash once we tap into the potential of each and every student. So that's, I think it's a tough message to deliver, but that's where I'm at on it.
Thank you, Justin. And Don, I guess you get to be the tail.
Okay, thank you. And I have some new stuff. Okay. That being said, the good news is the last year or two, local taxpayer burden, the school district did not add to the weight of that. That's good news. And so this burden that we're speaking of often is coming into play from the pressures of the city and the county, okay? Though that's not to be dismissive of the concern for the taxpayers who are on fixed incomes. I think we should be fiscally responsive and efficient in all that we do. And I'm just convinced that with education, if you will, informing the public that literally 75% of the current funding comes from the state, and actually probably only, less than 20%, and I don't want to get bogged down in terms of the percentages, but it is important, I think, that our taxpayers know that as the local community continues to grow, actually that tax burden is spread out. And even though they may see an increase in their property, the value of their property, it's not necessarily directly relatable to an increase on their taxes. So let's continue, the growth of, or the position of community growth and expansion and being that city, that destination for all to come and to benefit from.
Thanks, Don. I think we have time for one more question to allow time for your closing comments. Just to give you all a kind of a heads up on the closing comments, we'll be starting with position 3, and Karen, you'll be given the first shot at that.
Okay.
But we do have one final question. It comes from a member of the community. And this is not one you've received ahead of time. do you support police liaison officers within the various schools? If not, why not? If yes, why? And with this, we'll start with position 7 and Mark.
We've been asked this question actually at our last forum. It depends. Quite honestly, we have a study session coming up on this very exact topic. And hopefully at that study session, we'll see data that is either supportive or not of having SROs in our schools. I do feel that if we do have SROs, they should be paired with social workers. And I do feel, you know, back to the last question of budgetary and taxes, I do feel that the city of Rochester could carry the entire financial burden instead of 50% of the financial burden for an SRO if they are within our schools. So at this point in time, you know, not to give a wishy-washy answer, but I am not sure if we should have SROs, and I will be getting information soon to see it. And I would invite the viewing public to listen in on our study session to hear what we hear. And then feel free to let me know what your thoughts are after hearing what we hear at that study session as well.
Okay, Jess?
So for me, that's a clear no. And the reason being, for those of you who are only seeing of me tonight, I work on the confinement end of the prison to confinement pipeline, and there's a lot of data to suggest, and that I professionally see every day, that school liaison officers, or school resource officers as the district calls them, just provides an easement to me for students who might not necessarily otherwise need to come to me. And I know that Karen, I don't mean to steal your thunder, that she'll discuss how potentially the school resource officers can provide supports to victims, or maybe they feel safer with them in the schools. I would posit that I recognize the need to have some sort of consistency that doesn't necessarily need to happen in the building. So if there's already a school resource officer in existence and there's a partnership that's already been created, whatever positive aspects come out of this data that the school is going to be receiving, doesn't, you know, they can be sort of the identified person who might respond to an incident at the school. And I would just say, even in my own personal experience of having a school resource officer in my high school and middle school, is that they're not necessarily any quicker to responding to an incident as they would be if they were just down at the precinct. So and while they did offer some assistance to those who were victims, very rarely was it victim to perpetrator within the school, meaning that if somebody was going to aggress towards the identified survivor or victim, they likely weren't on campus. And I think that there are other ways that we can address some of the issues, and this certainly would reduce, I think, the racial disparity in some of the disciplinary practices. I would also agree with Mark that if we increase mental health services and social services within the schools, our need for a school resource officer would most certainly decrease, for sure. So I would be a no on that one.
Thank you, Jess. Position 1, we'll start with Don.
Thank you for the question. And one thing I've learned as being a member of the board and undergoing the mandatory training, we're told to don't telegraph or take a position in advance of receiving or hearing the information. While you can be free to have an opinion or thought, don't base a future vote based on your opinion or thought. So having said that, I'm definitely open to, I have heard the voices of many of our students who believe that they are being negatively impacted, oppressed by the presence of police in schools. I have a number of questions myself, which I will be forwarding to district cabinets starting tomorrow for seeking answers for those questions so I can better understand. So yes, there are mechanisms. If there are trauma-related issues, They need to be addressed. You know, we're big on social emotional learning. Could that be why there may be these behavioral issues that are occurring in school? That's not really a policing issue. That's a social emotional issue that are better addressed through counselors, social workers, and maybe even additional layering of supports within our schools. So I'm looking forward. Director Schlusner had alluded to that study session, which is the 29th of September, 5 o'clock. So want you to be a part of that. And I think as a community, you'll be proud of the role that your current elected board members will take in providing leadership on this very important issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Justin?
So similarly, you know, I've heard a fair amount about the costs that we may be incurring by virtue of having school resource officers that do not, by their presence, by their very presence in the schools, do not lend themselves to providing an engaging learning environment for many learners. And that's been evidenced by the petitions that were circulated last summer, by you know, the separate group, the Rochester Community Initiative, and some of the stories that they've shared in other student groups. It's also not isolated to Rochester. There's a nationwide movement to reconsider the role of police officers in schools right now, and we'd certainly be fools to not learn from best practices that are starting to emerge elsewhere. What I haven't heard yet, and I'll be tuning in along with, I'm sure, many of the rest on the call here next week for the study session to hear what the principals and what the school staff feel are good reasons to have them now, and what is working well, to the extent that there are roles that are being filled that are important, to what extent that those roles be filled by another a role instead. And I guess as that's being framed up, I'd look to the Safe Schools Levy and just acknowledge that while the funds from that levy can be used to pay the salaries or partial salaries of school resource officers, they can be used equally well to pay for school counselors, school nurses, drug abuse programs, other forms of security, and other forms of keeping a school environment safe. And so those funds really are fungible between different ways of keeping a school environment safe. And I look forward to evaluating that keenly to see if really school resource officers are the best single way to advance that goal.
Thanks, Justin. Deborah?
Thanks. I don't know what more I can say that hasn't been said. I guess I'll give you my opinion, other than looking forward to information next week. Looking at the duty list of student resource officers, it is quite lengthy. And so I've asked the superintendent to look at those things and sort of theme them together. There are certainly things that are student contact, parent contact, staff contact, and then look at how much they are actually doing those things during the day and during their duty day. I think that will be really illuminating for board members and the public at large, good or bad. We will just know what their day is like. The other thing that I think is really important to recognize is, this has been an ongoing contract since, I don't know, 19 whatever. As after the murder of George Floyd and social justice issues coming to the fore, this issue sort of took the spotlight. Do we need school resource officers, and do we need them in Rochester? And I want to stay really specific about what the reality is for Rochester. The fact that the board is willing to look at this, I think, is not just about community pressure. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's indicative of, we will, it's part of our job. We're focused on accountability, and when you know better, you do better. And so I think it's really going to be a great opportunity to have a learning information session and a discussion about not only school resource officers. I believe that, you know, I will try to keep us on topic as much as I can to my ability, but really that this is just a piece of all the work that's going on in our district around safety and security, social justice and equity.
And Karen.
Thank you for the question. This is a tough question for me, and I'll explain why. But ultimately, if the question is, do the police liaison, or I'm sorry, police school resource officers have a role in our school district? I believe, in my opinion, the answer is still yes. And I'll tell you why. That as I indicated earlier, I worked for the county in the county attorney's office from 1999 to 2016. About the last half of that, I was the primary person that those school resource officers would call if they had a question about how to handle something at the school. I mean, they would call their supervisors, obviously, a lot of that too, but from a legal perspective, I was their go-to person in the county to call to ask questions about, you know, how should we address this, you know, gray situation in our school. So I, you know, interacted with them a ton, talked to them at length about their work. I had them, you know, come to my office and chat with me. They were witnesses in a lot of my cases over the years. And they did an excellent job. That I think that during that time frame, they provided a very good resource that the school needed at the time. I haven't looked at the schools that closely, other than my son is a student in high school now, that closely since 2016. But I think there have been some changes. I think I even saw it as I was starting to leave the office, that when I worked with the resource officers in that time period up to 2016, the officers did not wear uniforms at school. And I think that that's a significant difference. They do wear uniforms now. And I would like to, one of the questions I would ask if I were on the board now is, do they have their handguns with them when they're in the school, their sidearms? What other equipment do they have with them? I think would make a big difference in my mind. I've heard concerns from the community, and I value those concerns. Things like having the squad car with their rifles parked right in front of the school. That's not necessary. Students don't need to see that as they're coming to school every day. I think that is harmful. But are there things that can be done to make this better? And part of what informs me in this opinion is we aren't as restrictive as some schools in our state in terms of safety. I thought a little bit about, I watched some school board meetings about it. There's a school district in the Twin Cities that uses more behavioral social workers to respond to safety. But the thing I noticed about that district, somebody brought to my attention, is that they have metal detectors as they go into the school. That's a very different safety mechanism than what Rochester uses. So in some ways, I would put out the idea that the school resource officers are a lesser restrictive safety measure than a metal detector. I'm an attorney. I go through courthouses that have to go through metal detectors every time I go in. It's stressful. I mean, I don't like doing that. I mean, you feel like you're doing something wrong every time. That I wouldn't want to put our students in that position either. So finally, just to wrap it up, I would want to take a very close look at this issue, ask some of those questions. But I wanted to address what Jeff said earlier, if I can just have a minute to do that. The response time from somewhere else in the community to a school to address, you know, unfortunately, I prosecuted people that one student assaulted another student. We would have to rely on the teachers and staff to address that situation. A lot of times that was what the resource officers were doing. They could get there quickly with a radio call, but a call to 911 to outside the school to an officer coming in would not have time to respond. And it could be any officer from the street. It could be a rookie with 2 weeks experience who's never been in a high school. Cut me off. Thank you.
Okay. I want to give us time for you all to make your closing comments, and Karen, take a breath, because it's,
I get to go.
I want to give you a heads up that we'll hear a minute from each of the candidates. They've been given a minute for a closing comment and to use that time however they choose. And we'll be starting with Karen.
Thank you. And thank you for the organizers tonight. This has been a great discussion. I am running for Rochester School Board because I believe I can bring a fresh perspective to the board decisions. As we've talked about a lot tonight, the current pandemic is impacting our entire community. The district's going to need to make some hard decisions. And we need to make use some thoughtful and creative solutions, some broad community input, some collaboration, and clear communication. We have a growing community, as we've talked about tonight, which means changing facility and community needs. The district creates a welcoming environment, but I think there's still more work to do in terms of education equity, the opportunity gaps, and the discipline disparities that we've talked about tonight. As I indicated earlier, I've served as an attorney in the juvenile court system. I think I can bring a different perspective to those important issues. And I believe it's important that the district engage students and families and acknowledge their current realities. Students deserve engaging learning environments where their lives and their circumstances of all the students are reflected in the curriculum and the classroom conversations. If you want to learn more about any of the candidates, I would give a plug for the League of Women Voter Forums that were held last week. They're on the public library website. And if you want to learn more about me individually, my website is KarenMcLaughlin.com. If you like what you hear, I'd ask for your vote between now and November 3rd. Thank you.
And a reminder that Karen is seeking position 3 on the board, and the incumbent in that position is Deborah. We'll hear from you next, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you to the In the City for Good for providing this forum, and thank you to my fellow candidates. So why now and why again? I believe our district needs strong, experienced leaders and continuity of service. It takes a while to get your feet under you when you come on school board, and honestly, we don't have a lot of time to waste. It's a critical time for decision-making, strategic thinking, and vision. Well, these are challenging times. I think they're also great potential for opportunity. COVID has turned our educational world upside down, but what have we been saying for years? We want to rethink education. So during the pandemic learning last spring, our educators demonstrated their ability to be flexible and nimble. And did everything go smoothly? No, but we took what we learned and focused on best practices moving forward. And I believe our staff is up to the challenge to meet hybrid and distance learning this year. What else has the pandemic exposed? That schools are doing more than educating kids. Meals, technology, access to internet, mental health, childcare. Those of us in the system know we've been keeping our heads down and doing the work because that's what district staff has always done. Now it seems everyone knows and people want to support our schools. My work on and off the board continues to be focused on community engagement. More stakeholder feedback and true engagement will lead us to finding solutions together. You can learn more about me at deborahsalinger.com or find me on Facebook. And no matter what, please remember to vote on November 3rd.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from the 2 candidates for position 7, and we'll start with Jess.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for having us. And thank you for everyone who's watching online. I'm running for Rochester Public School Board because I have personal experience and professional knowledge needed to get the district to achieving its goal of implementing true and lasting equitable change. And as you can see, I have no issue with being clear and open, even when the issue before us is a difficult one. Overall, my platform is focused on mental health assessment and access to services, not just for our students, but for the larger community as well. My platform is also strong in diversity, equity, and inclusivity, so we can build a multicultural climate and flourish as a district. There's also emphasis on physical and cyber safety throughout our buildings, and certainly through this distance learning period, that's important. And we've also been going through a lot, all of us, since March, some more intensely and more consistently than others. And our children and our community need help healing for so many different reasons. And I think my platform is a good basis for that, to create a healthier, more welcoming and safer district. I would love to help us get there. So if you'd like to be part of that movement, you can find me at www.drjessgarcia.com. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And please vote for Dr. Jess Garcia for Rochester Public School Board Seat 7. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark?
Hello, everybody. First off, thanks for hosting this event again. It's wonderful to get our voices heard and our opinions out to the community as well. The skill set that I bring to the school board is, as an engineer, I am used to looking at complex environments, complex scenarios, and complex problems. When you look at all the questions that we had tonight, they are not a bunch of individual questions that have individual effects on nothing else. They all affect one another. All aspects of everything we do affects everything else. So again, that's the skill set that I bring to the board, is understanding complex environments, which the school district is, with lots of moving parts. They're all intertwined and are all important. Budgetary items are as important, if not more, than others as well, because when we want to do great programs, especially around equity education, it costs money. If we don't have the money, we can't do what we need to do. It's understanding that complexity that is the strength that I bring. I've been on the school board now for coming up on 4 years. This is my first term, and I do feel that re-election to a second term would only make me more effective as well. You know, I do now have the experience in a team environment, because I am one of 7. All of us here are one of 7. And it's understanding those relationships with the other board members as well that can help move the district in a direction that we want to move it to. If you want to know more about me, you can go to my website, schluss2020.com, and I look forward to your vote on November 3rd or before.
Thank you, Mark. And now finally, the 2 candidates for position 1, and we'll start, Don, with you.
Thank you for tuning in this evening, and the City for Good for hosting this important event. I won't take the time to tell you what I've done, though I'm quite proud of the many accomplishments I've made. I will spend a moment or two sharing with you who I am. And I am a person of character and integrity. I am a person who is approachable, who takes the time to listen, to consider, to evaluate. I am a person who desires your vote, your support. I recognize further that without you, I'm just like a flag flapping in the wind. I need your support. We need your voice as a board to continue this great work we've continued. I don't represent myself as a one having a platform or a campaign for you to support. I represent myself as being a member, a team member, one of 7 that I ask you to be fully supportive of. Thank you.
Thank you. And Justin.
Yes, so thank you once again to In the City for Good and everybody that organized this forum. It's been wonderful. A little bit about myself. I have 4 kids in the district, a 5th grader, a 3rd grader, a kindergartner, all at Jefferson, and a preschooler at Hoover Early Learning. My wife is a resident in pathology at Mayo, and I'm an intellectual property lawyer. I work remotely for a company based in New York, and I've been doing that for a while. I'm running more than anything else because I want this district and I want this board to be more ambitious for what it is that we're trying to do to this community. I have a bold vision of Rochester as truly being a center of excellence in public education, a place where people want to come, a force that makes it easier for our major employers to attract and retain talent, a force that makes leads to a more vibrant and robust economic future. And part of what I think helps us get there is smaller schools. We had some questions we didn't get to on that today. Smaller schools foster a greater sense of community where students and their family more readily get to know each other, experience empathy for one another. Studies have shown that students in smaller schools fight less, feel closer connections with each other, report a greater sense of attachment, community, and inclusivity, and overall, just a greater sense of camaraderie. Every student does better in a smaller school. My vision is primary schools with grade cohorts of no more than 3 sections. And moreover, I think the K-8 delivery model does this even better than the K-5 because students know each other over an even greater length of time. If you want to know more about me, check me out at justinmcook.com. I'd love to have your support. Thanks.
Thank you all. We certainly appreciate all of you who've joined us this evening to hear these candidates. And a reminder, this event has been recorded so others can view it. And we certainly thank the candidates. In the City for Good has had a long, since our founding, has been interested in civic participation and civic governance. And though we feel that we all have a responsibility to participate in that, we certainly appreciate that there are some of us who take on a very special role and stand for office. And we appreciate those of you who have served and those of you who are willing to serve. And we wish you all luck in the election. A reminder, you'll be voting for one person for each of these positions. And we urge you, as one of you said, to either vote now or vote in November. But whatever you do, please vote. So thank you all. And again, thanks to the candidates. And we really appreciate your views and thoughtful responses to the questions that we ask you this evening. So have a good night, and we'll close off our forum. Thank you.
Thank you.